I'm happy to be sharing this morning. The Clergy and Ritual Committee have been working to engage congregants, and we wanted to use the summer to give our wonderful and hardworking clergy a bit of a break after a particularly trying 16 months. Some offering drashot in the next few weeks will talk about the social justice work they do through CBE and the Tikkun Alliance. We want you to know about this important work and encourage you to become involved. For now, Parshas Pinchas. As a reminder, we Israelites have been Bamidbar in the desert for 40 years. We've wandered and engaged enemies who cursed and warred against us. We've suffered plagues when some among us turn away from the way of God. We've met others, including a particular donkey, who see what others cannot, who turn from misdeed, who advocate for justice to follow the way of God. This week's Parsha begins with a resolution of the plague that ended the last Parsha. Then, in the context both of the battles that will follow and the security that will come with the settling of the promised land, in Bamidbar 26th, the Lord instructs Moses and Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, take a census of the whole Israelite community from the age of 20 years up, by their ancestral houses, all Israelites able to bear arms. Then, among these shall the land be apportioned as shares. The land, moreover, is to be apportioned by lot, and the allotment shall be made according to the listings of their ancestral tribes. The text tells us the results of the census, tribe by tribe. Then in 27:1, we meet the daughters of Zelophehad. It says, the daughters of Zelophehad of the Manassite family, son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came forward. The names of the daughters were Mala, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And they said, our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, which banded together against the Lord, but died of his own sin, and he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen. And remarkably, Moses brings their case to God, and God says in 27:7, the plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them. Is this a victory for women's rights? It's surely not a perfectly just story. The daughters are granted the right to inherit their father's land, but are then told they need to marry within their clan. But startlingly, God has just delivered the law. These women raised their voices to Moses and petitioned for change, and they were successful, their petition being deemed just. When we look at the text, we see that God's directions created a systemic problem. People are left out. How are we to determine the allocation of land and wealth in the promised land that is the basis of people's security and dignity? Is it based on the generation who left Egypt and their male heirs who could care for their wives and daughters? What about those who had daughters but left no male heirs? Where are those women to find their security and dignity? The daughter's petition creates another problem. How do we resolve a systemic injustice when we are not God who can just say their plea is just? The rabbis who were concerned with creating guidelines for society and living in accordance with God's will, they read a lot into this episode and the daughters. They see the connection between the daughters and their ancestors, the merit in the daughters as petitioners. They see validity in their argument and in their process. The rabbis point out the daughter's connection with ancestors. The daughter's petition is to argue that security and dignity is not just for those who are present and entering the land, but is owed to the descendants of those who participated in the Exodus. The rabbis point out that the daughters are connected all the way back to Joseph, who is committing to having his bones carried forth from Egypt to the promised land. Rabbis explore the validity of the daughter's claim. Seforno weighs in on the idea that their father died on account of his own sin and not because he was part of the revolt of Korach. The rabbis argue that it would not have been just to exclude the daughters from the security that would come with land based on what happened in the intervening years. The rabbis consider the daughters' merit, the merit of the petitioners. Sifri comments that the reason the Torah mentions all their ancestors was to inform us that all of the ancestors were righteous people. Rashi comments similarly that when people are mentioned by name without their specific accomplishments being detailed, this means that they were righteous. The Talmud debates what we should learn from the fact that they are named and listed in different orders in different places. They focus on the daughter's intelligence and their ability to communicate as those who would be most affected by the injustice and who most knew what they needed to live lives of security and dignity. Lastly, rabbis including Or HaChaim focus on the daughter's process. The Or HaChaim interprets the word V'tikravna, they approached or drew near, and says that before appearing before Moses, the daughters consulted with each other and had become convinced that they had a valid claim. He sees the second mention of their lineage to be indicative that before approaching Moses, they consulted the elders of their tribe. He goes on to comment that they were initially bashful, but once they consulted the elders, they shed their veil of timidity and go directly to the seat of power before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. I read this story and found deep resonance for today and connection to the work I'm participating in with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. The modern Poor People's Campaign has its roots in the work of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Over time, King turned from fighting for civil rights to fighting for human rights. He began to talk more about the interfunctioning evils of racism and poverty and the war economy. He offered an analysis that these problems had to be understood and combated together. He marched with Black Christian leaders and with white Jewish leaders. He began organizing, like in his support of sanitation workers, not only poor Blacks, but also poor whites. This was powerful and threatening, and many say that this effort to unite the poor is what led to his assassination. Still, after he was killed in April of 1968, poor people from around the country convened in Washington, D.C. in the summer of '68, constructed a temporary resurrection city, and lived and learned and petitioned the government to address these systemic problems. The modern Poor People's Campaign expands to look at the interfunctioning evils of racism, poverty, militarism, and also the evil of environmental degradation, and the evil of the false moral narrative of Christian nationalism. The Poor People's Campaign has done extensive work to validate their claims and frame their petitions. The campaign conducted an audit of poverty in America and published The Soul of Poor Folk, detailing pre-pandemic the 140 million poor and low-wealth Americans, Black and white of all faiths and in all communities, including our own, fellow Americans who could not survive if they became sick, lost their jobs, or hit with an unexpected bill of even $400. They published the Poor People's Moral Budget to combat the narrative that we are suffering scarcity and don't have the resources, but instead recognize that we live in a world of plenty. The budget sets out the roadmap for a path that will allow us to invest the resources we have in ways that actually drive economic growth while providing for people's dignity and security. The campaign has called for a third Reconstruction and supports the legislation introduced post-pandemic at the end of May, HR Res 438. It's entitled The Third Reconstruction, Fully Addressing Poverty and Low Wages from the Bottom Up. The merit and moral force of the campaign is evidence in its leaders, Bishop William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris, and also from among the strong support of other faith leaders, including Rabbi Pesner and Rabbi Jacobs from our own denomination. The leaders use their influence to build a platform on which to elevate the voices of those most affected, who know the problems because they live with the consequences, who know what needs to be done because they know what they need to live a life of security and dignity. And the Poor People's Campaign is petitioning those in power, marching in state capitals in Washington, D.C., to make the case for justice, security, and dignity. Recently, they marched on Manchin and McConnell's offices in D.C., calling for voting rights and an end to the false moral narrative that values bipartisanship and the filibuster over true justice. We are working to educate, organize, and mobilize supporters for justice within our communities and for a massive national march on Washington, June 18th, 2022. I hope you'll be intrigued and engaged. Each Shabbat, as Rabbi Tamona points out, we hear our ancient Torah, the prophetic Haftarah, and then consider the implications for us today. Today, Cantor Breitzer chanted the Declaration of Independence as prophetic text. The Declaration points out the problems that existed in colonial society and the ways the particular monarchical government fell short. The Declaration is aspirational. It calls on mere humans to sacrifice, to align with justice, to do the hard work. We know that the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and even the Constitution are imperfect. On July 4th, we celebrate not a perfect union, but the start of a journey towards justice, security, and dignity. I hope we are inspired to use the lessons of those who came before us, to recognize the evils we need to address, to build a platform from which we can hear from those most affected, and ally with them in a call for change, as we help to move into the promised land, a more perfect union, a country of security, dignity, and justice.